Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Whether you're tuning in on your commute, at the gym, or just, relaxing at home, we are thrilled to have you with us today.
Absolutely.
And before we jump into the material, I want to ask you right now to please take a second to like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. It really helps us continue bringing you these detailed explorations.
It does make a huge difference.
Yeah, it really does. So today we are undertaking an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly truly fascinating review of an explosive new ebook. It's titled Virtue of Foresight, Men's Premonition, Strategy and Synchronicity, and it's written by Conrad Riker.
And you are absolutely going to want to check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks to buy this book for yourself after we finish.
For sure. And while you're at it, make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker. That's the @ Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing essays and updates.
Because it is a massive text. I mean, the scope of the history, the philosophy, and the cultural critique we need to cover today is going to require a lot of careful unpacking.
It is, and I want to set the stage for you, the listener, right from the opening minute. We've custom tailored this deep dive specifically to hook you based on the sources provided. Because this material is custom tailored for men who are seeking a red-pilled perspective on modern society. Specifically, if you identify as a men's rights activist, an MRA, or if you're active in the manosphere and want to deeply understand the historical architecture of our institutions.
Before they were, as the author argues, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Exactly. This deep dive is constructed for you. Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack the historical timelines, the biological arguments, and the really intensive cultural critiques that Riker uses to completely dismantle modern narratives around gender, authority, and societal structure.
We are going to go deep into everything from ancient biblical etymology to the modern algorithmic manipulation of your social media feeds.
But before we take that plunge, it's essential that we do something first.
Yes, I need to issue a mandatory impartiality disclaimer here.
For
The source material we're reviewing today contains highly politically charged content. It touches extensively on both left-wing and right-wing ideologies.
heavily.
Yeah, and it navigates deeply controversial views on gender, and it levels systemic structural critiques at modern society. I want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we, as your hosts, are not taking sides.
We're not.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the political arguments, or the historical claims contained in this content. Our role today is to act strictly as impartial guides.
Just laying it out.
Exactly. We're simply here to convey, deeply analyze, and help you understand the specific ideas, arguments, and frameworks presented in the original source material.
That is the goal. We're here to read the map, not to tell you where to drive. So let's start at the very beginning of the author's argument. Riker opens the book by establishing what he calls the divine blueprint and contrasting it with the complacency virus.
And to anchor this, he doesn't start with abstract philosophy. He starts with a very visceral historical image from 1936.
Yeah, he asks the reader to envision a farmer in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl.
Right.
He describes a man standing in a completely barren field. The wind is whipping dry topsoil into his eyes. His kids are coughing in the background as the soil literally turns to powder and blows across the continent all the way to Washington, D.C.
And Riker uses this ecological disaster to make a really profound point about the Adamic mandate found in the book of Genesis.
He argues that the Dust Bowl wasn't merely a tragic weather event, right?
No, he says it was a fundamental failure of men who viewed the land purely as a resource to extract from, rather than an inheritance to steward.
He contrasts this extractive mindset with what he defines as true masculinity, which he says is stewardship and cultivation.
And the linguistic breakdown he provides to support this is quite rigorous.
I found that part fascinating.
It is. Riker dives into the actual etymology of the ancient biblical Hebrew to challenge modern interpretations of the text. Because often, secular and feminist critiques will point to Genesis 1.28, the explicit command given to humanity to have dominion over the earth.
Right, and they frame that word dominion as a divine license for male oppression, tyranny, and ecological destruction.
Exactly. But Riker argues that this is a fundamental mistranslation of the ancient worldview. He traces the Hebrew word for man, Adam. He points out it directly translates to earthling because it's derived from the word Adama, which means the soil or the red ground.
So the very identity of the man is literally tied to the dirt he is supposed to be working.
That's his point. And Riker contrasts this Hebrew concept with Indo-European linguistic roots. For instance, the Latin word homo or the Greek word anthropos heavily emphasize man as a rational, thinking being separated from nature.
Interesting.
But in the Hebrew text, man's core identity is inextricably linked to the ground he tends. Furthermore, Riker notes that the Hebrew word for a male warrior, or husband, ish, doesn't even emerge in the text until after Adam is named Eve and fully accepted his relational and protective duties.
So Riker's central argument here is that true strength, the original masculine blueprint, is inherently generative.
It's protective, not parasitic.
Dominion in this framework doesn't mean tyrannical control, it means profound, burdensome care.
Yes.
It's an interesting reframing of a concept that usually gets heavily criticized. And the author actually brings in a rather unexpected cultural critique to illustrate the modern failure of this concept. He looks at the famous Dr. Seuss children's book, The Lorax.
Oh, yeah. This part was wild.
Riker points out that the Lorax is constantly screaming at the Onceler to stop cutting down the truffula trees for profit. It perfectly captures that extractive, destructive mindset.
Right.
But Riker argues that the book, and by extension, modern environmentalism, demands emotional outrage without ever offering a hero who actually picks up a shovel and replants the forest.
He argues that modern society teaches men to be either the greedy Onceler or the complaining Lorax, leaving out the role of the restorative steward.
And to ground this in reality, Riker provides a contemporary case study. He details the story of a West Texas rancher.
This was a great example.
This man inherited 1,200 acres of completely degraded, cracked, hardpan earth. The land had been heavily overgrazed by his grandfather back in the 1950s, a man who was chasing short-term profit yields without considering the ecological consequence.
But the modern rancher, recognizing this failure, completely changed tactics.
Yeah, he introduced high-density rotational grazing to mimic the natural movement of bison. He painstakingly replanted deep-rooted native grasses. He allowed the soil long periods of rest.
And the text notes that within 10 years, this rancher didn't just stop the bleeding. He doubled the local biodiversity and increased the soil carbon retention by 35%.
Riker frames this rancher as the ultimate living embodiment of the Adamic mandate in action. It's a man utilizing strategy, sweat, and foresight to regenerate the earth rather than just consuming it until it's dead.
That transition from extracting to regenerating perfectly sets up his next major archetype, which he calls the repentant warrior.
Right. And when looking for the ultimate model of this integrated masculinity, Riker points directly to the biblical King David.
And what stands out is that he doesn't present a sanitized Sunday school version of David. He dives straight into David's massive catastrophic flaws.
Oh, absolutely. The book details how David, at the height of his power, committed adultery with Bathsheba and then essentially orchestrated a military hit on her husband Uriah to cover it up.
It is an abuse of power on the highest level.
It really is.
Yet for Riker, the defining masculine moment isn't the crime itself, it's the aftermath.
The confrontation.
Yes, it's the specific moment when the prophet Nathan confronts David. Nathan tells the king a parable about a wealthy man who steals a poor man's only beloved lamb to feed a guest. David is furious at the injustice in the story, and Nathan simply looks at the most powerful man in the kingdom and says, "You are the man."
And Riker emphasizes the psychological weight of David's reaction here.
Exactly. David possessed absolute monarchical power, but he didn't gaslight the prophet.
Yeah.
He didn't order Nathan's execution. He didn't deflect blame onto his advisors, nor did he blame his childhood or the pressures of the crown.
He simply and immediately stated, "I have sinned."
He absorbed the full weight of accountability.
The author contrasts this historical model of accountability with the archetypes we see in modern Hollywood. Riker argues that Hollywood currently only permits two narrow, dysfunctional options for men on screen.
Right. On one side, you have the emotionally constipated, hyper-stoic action star who shoots up a city and never sheds a tear or shows a moment of internal reflection.
And on the other side,
You have the permanently neurotic, weepy therapy patient who is constantly talking about his feelings, but is completely incapable of holding down a job or protecting anyone in a crisis.
Riker points out that King David was a man who led armies and conquered nations, but he was also the man who wrote 73 of the Psalms. He poured out raw, unfiltered emotion, agonizing guilt, and transcendent poetry.
And Riker attempts to map this integrated archetype onto the modern era, using the example of Chris Kyle, the renowned U.S. Navy SEAL sniper.
The text notes that Kyle was arguably the deadliest sniper in American military history.
Yet, Riker points out that Kyle wasn't the cold-blooded sociopath that his harshest critics try to paint him as. He was a man deeply integrated into his family.
He was a man who came home from grueling combat deployments and sang lullabies to his children. a man who took his daughter to Disneyland.
Riker asserts that modern left-wing ideology actively attacks this specific archetype. According to the text, this ideology seeks to replace the capable warrior with the conscientious objector and the truth-telling prophet with the corporate diversity consultant.
The integrated strength of a Chris Kyle, or King David, a man who is simultaneously a fiercely lethal protector and a deeply gentle father, is what Riker identifies as the true, uncorrupted divine blueprint.
And the tragic consequence of society losing its grip on that blueprint is what Riker diagnoses as the complacency virus.
To prove that this isn't just a philosophical grievance, he brings in some very sobering, hard data.
The BLS statistics.
Yes, he cites the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, pointing out a startling trend. The workforce participation rate for prime-aged American men between the ages of 25 and 54, has plummeted.
In 1950, it was at 86%.
And by 2023, it had dropped to just 68%.
That means nearly 1 in 5 prime-aged men has simply vanished from the labor force. They aren't looking for work. They have just checked out.
And Riker views this statistical drop as a glaring symptom of civilizational decay.
He explicitly connects this modern phenomenon to the historical analysis found in Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
The argument being that Rome didn't ultimately fall because the invading barbarian tribes were simply too strong.
Right. Rome fell because Roman men stopped believing in the idea of Rome. They became seduced by endless leisure, bread, and circuses, and they began outsourcing the hard physical defense of their borders to foreign mercenaries.
Riker sees a direct parallel in modern Western men outsourcing their responsibilities and retreating into digital escapism.
He also looks internationally, pointing to Japan's lost decades and the well-documented rise of what are called herbivore men in Japanese society.
These are young men who actively avoid marriage, avoid seeking sexual relationships, and completely reject career ambition.
And the book argues that they aren't engaged in some grand ideological rebellion. They're just paralyzed by comfort. They've chosen a frictionless existence over the friction required to build a life.
And here is a pivot in the book that I found particularly thought-provoking. Riker, who is clearly writing for a right-leaning, red-pilled audience, actually utilizes a core Marxist concept to critique modern corporate capitalism.
Yes, that's a really nuanced rhetorical move. Riker explicitly states that while Karl Marx was disastrously wrong about the solution's communism, Marx actually nailed the diagnosis of alienation.
In sociological terms, alienation refers to the psychological disconnect a worker feels when they're separated from the final product of their labor.
And Riker applies this concept directly to modern white-collar office work. He argues that millions of men are sitting in beige cubicles, endlessly shuffling digital tokens, formatting spreadsheets, and producing absolutely nothing tangible in the physical world.
This separation from physical creation, he argues, leads directly to spiritual emasculation.
He uses an incredibly vague phrase to describe the modern corporate routine of spending 3 hours a day on redundant emails and Zoom calls.
Oh, I remember this.
He calls it taxidermy for the soul.
Taxidermy for the soul. Wow.
You look alive on the outside, but inside, the vital essence has been hollowed out and stuffed with corporate jargon.
That sense of hollowing out is exactly why Riker champions the return to physical labor as a deeply restorative act. He doesn't just theorize about it. He details a 30-day labor challenge that he ran with a group of profoundly disaffected, depressed young men.
The rules were simple but strict. They were required to do 30 minutes of tangible, sweat-inducing physical work every single day for a month.
It couldn't be going to the gym. It had to be productive. They had to build a fire pit in the backyard, fix a broken fence, or learn how to sweat a copper pipe for basic plumbing.
And the outcomes he reports from this challenge are telling. Riker notes that the primary result wasn't just that these men got physically stronger or learned a new trade skill. The real transformation was psychological.
He observed restored male focus, significantly calmer moods, and a marked decrease in their relational anxieties.
The philosophical takeaway Riker extracts here is profound. When a man engages with the physical world and bends it to his will to create something real and lasting, he himself becomes real.
It anchors him. The text frames this as a direct physical rejection of the complacency that is quietly eroding Western civilization. A complacency Riker likens to the invisible rust that silently ate away at the massive automotive factories of Detroit until they simply collapsed.
That anchoring in reality perfectly sets up the second major section of his thesis, the Foresight advantage and decision lattices.
The core argument here is that true masculinity, true leadership, requires the capacity to think in decades, not in days or news cycles.
He points to Winston Churchill as the historical gold standard for this.
The book describes Churchill standing in the British House of Commons in 1932. He stood up and explicitly warned his peers that a malign fiend was loose upon the earth, clearly referring to Adolf Hitler and the rising Nazi movement.
And the reaction. The political establishment laughed at him. They called him an alarmist.
The Nazi Party was still relatively small at that moment, and the horrors of the First World War were still so fresh that the idea of another global conflict felt impossible to the general public.
But Riker points out that Churchill wasn't looking at the daily polls. He was looking through a historical lens. Churchill had spent his wilderness years exhaustively studying the collapse of the Roman Republic and the military campaigns of Napoleon.
He was operating on a 30-year temporal horizon, mapping out the inevitable geopolitical consequences of a rearming Germany.
The text also parallels this with the ancient biblical narrative of Joseph in Egypt. Joseph interpreted the Pharaoh's dream and foresaw that 7 years of unprecedented abundance would be followed by 7 years of catastrophic famine.
He didn't just warn the Pharaoh, he immediately implemented a massive nationwide grain storage infrastructure.
Riker categorizes this ability to see the distant storm and build the shelter today as systems thinking. He argues this is the patriarchal mind operating at its highest frequency long-term, structured, accountable, and deeply responsible for the future survival of the tribe.
To help modern men actually cultivate this mindset, Riker introduces a practical framework he calls the decade lens and the 3x3 Foresight matrix.
It's a system for plotting out your life choices.
He instructs the reader to take any major decision and map its likely consequences across 3 time horizons, 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years.
You then categorize these consequences across 3 domains: your personal life, your professional life, and your spiritual or moral life.
Then you color code the matrix. Red signifies danger or degradation. Yellow indicates manageable risk or stagnation. Green represents compound growth and strengthening.
The term Riker uses for maintaining this system is epistemic hygiene. For those unfamiliar with the term, epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know.
So epistemic hygiene refers to the disciplined practice of keeping your knowledge base and your decision-making processes clean, rational, and free from the contamination of short-term emotional panic or viral outrage.
And Riker heavily contrasts the disciplined, long-term nature of the Foresight matrix with modern leftist and critical ideologies.
He categorizes these progressive movements as fundamentally reactionary tantrums.
According to the author, these ideologies rely entirely on manufacturing perpetual crisis and mining emotional outrage to sustain their momentum. Because they lack this decade lens, they fail completely under long-term historical scrutiny.
He argues that while movements rooted in Marxism or critical theory always promise rapid utopian equality, they historically deliver systemic chaos and poverty precisely because they are entirely blind to the long-term second and third order consequences of tearing down established institutions.
But Riker is very clear that adopting this level of foresight isn't a path to popularity. In fact, he warns that it comes with a severe social penalty.
He calls this penalty the Cassandra loop, named after the priestess in Greek mythology who is cursed to foresee the future but never be believed.
Riker argues that if you are a man who successfully plans ahead and identifies structural flaws before they collapse, society will initially punish you.
To illustrate this, he tells the incredible story of Dr. James Lavoie Sorensen. In 1957, Dr. Sorensen observed the incredibly high rates of infection and venous damage caused by the rigid steel needles used in hospitals.
Right.
Using his foresight, he invented and patented the modern flexible plastic 4V catheter. It was a revolutionary medical breakthrough.
Yet the immediate reception was entirely hostile. Riker details how established doctors mocked Sorensen, claiming his invention was unnecessary.
Nursing staff complained that the new plastic catheters were too complicated to learn how to insert.
Hospital procurement boards actively rejected the device for 15 solid years.
Wow.
It wasn't until the medical evidence of saved lives became absolutely overwhelming that the establishment finally relented. Today, that exact catheter design is used in over 80% of all hospitalizations worldwide.
So Riker uses Sorensen's ordeal to establish a sociological pattern. The man who plans ahead and disrupts the comfortable status quo is inevitably labeled a fearmonger, a nuisance, or a heretic.
Society will attack him until a disaster forces their hand, at which point society will quietly adopt his solution, validate his foresight, but rarely change its own reactive hostile conditioning toward the next man who tries to warn them.
So the question becomes, if society is naturally hostile to foresight, how do foresighted men actually enact change and wield power?
Riker answers this by exploring the concept of strategic delay. It's the idea that being right is not enough. You must also be perfectly timed.
He uses President Abraham Lincoln as the ultimate masterclass in this mechanic.
He examines the period immediately following the massive Union victory at the Battle of Antietam during the American Civil War.
Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation drafted and ready, but he intentionally delayed issuing it for 100 excruciating days.
And during those 100 days, Lincoln faced immense vitriolic criticism from his own political base. The radical abolitionists in the North accused the president of moral cowardice, claiming he had the blood of the enslaved on his hands for every day he waited.
But Riker dissects Lincoln's strategic calculus to argue that this delay was the exact opposite of cowardice. Lincoln understood a brutal truth of governance.
A moral declaration that lacks the sheer power to enforce it is nothing more than an empty sermon.
Lincoln knew he needed 3 specific factors to align perfectly before he moved. First, he needed absolute military readiness, meaning Union boots actively occupying Southern soil to physically enforce the freeing of the slaves.
Second, he needed Northern public sentiment to be galvanized by a military victory, ensuring they would support the pivot from merely preserving the Union to actively ending slavery.
Finally, and perhaps most crucially, he needed to maneuver European geopolitics to ensure that Britain and France wouldn't intervene militarily on the side of the Confederacy.
By waiting for those elements to align, Lincoln guaranteed the proclamation would shatter the Southern economy rather than just being a symbolic gesture.
Riker's overarching principle here is that moral principle without the mechanics of power is impotent. Lincoln understood the cold, hard mechanics of consequence.
That historical example is huge, but how does Riker apply that strategic delay to the world the listener is living in right now?
He brings it directly into the modern corporate arena. He analyzes a massive business acquisition. Microsoft's CEO, Satya Nadella, purchasing the open source platform GitHub for $7.5 billion.
Now, what makes this fascinating is that Google had actually outbid Microsoft. Google reportedly offered $10 billion for GitHub.
But the founders of GitHub chose to sell to Microsoft for significantly less money. Why? Because Nadella had utilized the decade lens.
Over several years, Nadella had been executing a strategic, quiet delay. He intentionally shifted Microsoft's internal culture from a closed, proprietary, highly combative environment to one that was incredibly open source friendly.
He optimized his company for long-term cultural alignment within the developer community, rather than just hoarding short-term cash to throw at acquisitions.
And Riker uses this corporate maneuver to introduce what he calls the Cultural Immunity Index. He suggests that men should evaluate the organizations they work for or the businesses they're building based on this index.
An organization scores high on the Cultural Immunity Index if it possesses a high tolerance for internal dissent, if it prioritizes merit and competence over ideological conformity, and if it maintains true viewpoint diversity rather than enforced groupthink.
Riker argues that as the global economy becomes increasingly volatile, the future will disproportionately reward those foresighted organizations that cultivate immunity to cultural hysterias, while severely punishing those that are merely reactive to the outrage of the day.
This analysis of corporate culture and ideological conformity brings us right to the threshold of the most controversial part of the book.
In the next section, Riker takes direct aim at what he terms the myth of equality and the double bind.
This is where his critique of modern workplace dynamics and societal expectations of men becomes intensely specific and highly contentious.
To anchor this, he brings up a case that many in the tech world will remember: the firing of James Damore, the Google software engineer, in 2017.
Damore famously wrote an internal corporate memo where he cited numerous peer-reviewed studies drawn from the fields of evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics.
His core premise was simply to suggest that deeply ingrained biological differences between the sexes might partially explain why there is a gender gap in the engineering departments of the tech industry, rather than it being entirely the result of systemic, localized sexism at Google.
Riker highlights what he sees as the staggering hypocrisy of the corporate response. He points out that Google, as an institution, had spent tens of millions of dollars on mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training.
This training regularly preached a form of biological and social determinism when it came to systemic racism or gender identity, insisting that these factors fundamentally alter how a person experiences the world.
Yet, the moment Damore attempted to apply a similar lens of biological determinism to explain broad statistical differences in the occupational interests between men and women, he was immediately fired.
The corporate media branded him a heretic and a misogynist.
Riker uses this event to illustrate that within modern institutions, scientific inquiry into sex differences is only permitted if it yields politically correct conclusions. If the data suggests that men and women might naturally prefer different types of labor, the data is suppressed and the messenger is destroyed.
Riker labels this systemic, punishing expectation the masculinity tax. It's a core component of what sociologists call a double bind.
A situation where a person is given conflicting messages, ensuring that no matter what choice they make, they're wrong.
Riker argues that modern society places men in an inescapable double bind. On one hand, you, as a man, are socially and economically expected to be the primary provider.
But if you actually put your head down and work 60 to 70 hours a week to secure financial stability and a good neighborhood for your family, society shames you for being a workaholic or an emotionally absent father.
Conversely, the culture constantly tells men to open up, to be vulnerable, to cry, and to share their deepest insecurities.
But Riker argues that the second a man actually does this, he's secretly punished. His partner may lose attraction to him, his boss may view him as unstable, and society ultimately labels him as weak.
You're demanded to be soft, but penalized when you aren't hard.
The author takes this concept of the double bind beyond just cultural expectations and examines how it is explicitly enforced through institutional policy.
He provides a chilling, real-world example of what he terms the systemic suspicion of male intent. He cites official guidance released by a prominent California teachers union.
This formal union advice explicitly directed male teachers not to mentor male students in a one-on-one setting behind closed doors.
The stated reason was to avoid the appearance of inappropriate behavior.
Riker points out the devastating underlying assumption here. Female teachers mentor students one-on-one constantly, and society views it as a beautiful act of nurturing.
But when a male teacher attempts the exact same mentorship, the institution preemptively treats his intentions as inherently dangerous and predatory.
Riker argues that this institutionalized suspicion alienates men from the very professions like teaching and pediatrics, where boys desperately need male role models.
And according to Riker, this systemic bias against men is nowhere more powerful than in the legal system, specifically within family courts.
The book details the lingering ghost of the 1973 Tender Years Doctrine. Historically, this legal doctrine formally presumed that mothers were naturally and biologically superior caregivers for children.
And therefore should almost always be awarded primary custody in a divorce.
Now, legally, this doctrine has been officially abolished in the United States in favor of the best interests of the child standard.
However, Riker claims that this is merely a cosmetic change. He argues that judges, mediators, and social workers still operate heavily on this ingrained bias.
To back this up, he cites a recent U.S. Census Bureau report showing that a staggering 65% of all non-custodial parents are fathers.
The book also examines how pop culture serves as a propaganda arm to reinforce this demotion of the father figure. Riker analyzes the pervasive bumbling dad trope that dominates television and film.
He points to incredibly popular shows like Modern Family. The father character, Phil Dunphy, is constantly portrayed as an emotionally immature, well-meaning doofus who inevitably creates chaos.
And he must continually be rescued and corrected by the superior wisdom and competence of his wife.
Riker even extends this analysis to animated films like Pixar's The Incredibles. He notes that the patriarchal figure, Mr. Incredible, attempts to do his traditional biological job protecting society from physical danger, but he's ultimately punished by the state with crippling lawsuits for doing his job too well.
The overarching subliminal message being broadcast to young men, Riker argues, is that traditional male excellence, protective instinct, and authority are inherently dangerous to modern society and must be ridiculed, regulated, and suppressed.
But the author doesn't stop at merely cataloging these grievances. He pivots to a fierce, affirmative defense of traditional structures, arguing that hierarchy itself is completely natural, biologically hardwired, and fundamentally good for human flourishing.
He states quite bluntly that equality of dignity as a human being does not and cannot mean equality of function or outcome.
He uses a visceral biological analogy. Your liver and your brain possess equal dignity in keeping you alive, but they don't have equality of function. Your liver is not your brain, and if you tried to make them equal in function, the body would die.
To prove this applies to human organization, He cites a comprehensive 2018 Pentagon study that reviewed 127 different military combat operations.
The study's findings were stark. In 99.9% of the operations that resulted in critical mission failures or friendly fatalities, the root cause was traced back to a fractured or ambiguous chain of command.
When everyone is equally in charge, no one is in charge and people die.
Riker reinforces this point with a profound historical tragedy, the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
Most people know the story of the iceberg, but Riker dug into the transcripts of the official British inquiry following the disaster to understand the human failure.
He points out that many of the lifeboats were launched into the freezing ocean less than half full. Why did this happen when there were thousands of terrified people on the decks?
According to the inquiry, officers like Charles Lightoller hesitated. They received conflicting orders, they doubted their own absolute authority over the panicked passengers, and their reluctance to impose strict hierarchical order paralyzed the evacuation process.
Riker uses this to argue that in moments of extreme crisis, a democratized, egalitarian approach is lethal. The situation demands a rigid, uncompromising hierarchy to ensure survival.
The text then roots this absolute need for hierarchy deeply in evolutionary biology. Riker leans heavily on the now famous research popularized by clinical psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson regarding lobsters.
He explains that lobsters, which share a deep evolutionary ancestry with humans, organize their societies entirely through dominance hierarchies.
Furthermore, a lobster's position in that hierarchy is directly correlated with its neurochemistry, specifically its serotonin levels.
The dominant lobsters, those at the top of the hierarchy, have high serotonin, allowing them to walk tall and confidently claim territory. The subordinate lobsters have low serotonin and physically curl inward, avoiding conflict.
Riker's point is that the drive for status and hierarchy isn't a social construct invented by greedy European kings. It is an ancient evolutionary pathway, literally hardwired into our nervous systems over millions of years.
To show how successful human societies have historically managed this biological drive, Riker looks at the political structure of the ancient Roman Republic.
He details the cursus honorum, which translates to the course of honors. This was a strict, sequential ladder of political and military offices that any ambitious Roman man had to climb.
You couldn't simply be elected to the highest office of consul because you were popular or a good public speaker.
You had to first prove your competence and administrative capability in lower, grueling logistical roles, like managing the city's grain supply or serving as a junior military tribune.
The cursus honorum ensured that supreme authority was rigorously earned through demonstrated competence over decades, not merely democratized or handed out based on egalitarian ideals.
And Riker argues that when a society artificially removes or attacks the legitimate hierarchy, the result is never a peaceful utopia. The result is immediate, violent chaos.
He points to the civil unrest in Portland, Oregon during the year 2020. Amidst massive protests, the city implemented policies to effectively defund or severely restrict the authority and presence of the police force, the legitimate state-sanctioned hierarchy of order.
Riker notes the statistical aftermath.
Oh, yeah.
153% spike in car thefts, alongside skyrocketing rates of violent crime and arson.
He states a fundamental law of political physics. Nature abhors a power vacuum. When legitimate, structured authority withdraws due to political pressure, illegitimate, tyrannical authority, in the form of street gangs, cartels, and vigilante mobs, instantly rushes in to take its place.
The author then takes this argument against artificial equality and applies it to one of the most sacred cows of modern gender policy, Title IX.
Passed in 1972, Title IX was a federal civil rights law designed to prohibit sex-based discrimination in any school or education program receiving federal funding. In theory, it sounds perfectly just.
But Riker argues that the bureaucratic implementation of Title IX became an exercise in forcing impossible biological parity, because the law required schools to offer equal athletic opportunities proportional to their male and female student populations. Universities faced a math problem.
Female students were generally interested in forming massive athletic rosters compared to the male students who wanted to play football.
So to legally balance the numbers without losing federal funding, universities engaged in a massive culling of male athletics.
Riker cites data indicating that over 10,000 male college sports teams, predominantly working-class sports like wrestling, gymnastics, and track, were completely eliminated across the country to artificially inflate female sports participation ratios.
Riker asserts that destroying male opportunity to force a statistical parity that ignores biological differences in male competitive drive is not fairness, it's institutional fraud.
This direct, unvarnished critique of feminist policy implementation leads perfectly into the author's next major thematic target: deconstructing the feminist mystique and institutional capture.
Riker isn't just trying to tear down the modern structure, he actively attempts to completely reframe the traditional view of men and women working together.
To do this, he introduces what he calls the helpmeet doctrine. He goes back to the Hebrew text of Genesis 2.18, where God says he will make a helper suitable for Adam.
Modern secular culture often translates this word, helper, as a subservient, diminutive, almost childlike role, like a secretary or an assistant to the real boss.
But Riker aggressively pushes back on this interpretation. He analyzes the original Hebrew term used in the text, ezer kenegdo.
The linguistic context Riker provides here is fascinating. He points out that the word ezer is used 16 times in the Old Testament. In 14 of those 16 instances, the word does not refer to a subordinate assistant.
It refers to God himself intervening to save humanity from total military annihilation.
It is a word rooted in military salvation and overwhelming strength. Therefore, Riker argues, an ezer kenegdo, a helpmeet, is not a domestic servant who fetches slippers. She is a strategic force multiplier.
She's an equal, capable partner designed to cover the vulnerabilities and blind spots of the man in the shared battle of life.
To bring this ancient concept into modern clarity, Riker shares a compelling real-world anecdote. He recounts meeting a married couple who run a highly successful private security and logistics firm.
The husband is a combat-decorated Marine veteran. The wife has a background in corporate operations. The husband handles the tactical side. He trains the operatives, designs the security protocols, and manages the threat assessments.
And the wife runs the entirely different but equally vital side of the business. She manages the complex logistics, negotiates the high-stakes client contracts, and handles the corporate relations.
When Riker asked the wife who is truly in charge of the company, she gave an answer that defines Riker's ideal. She said, "We both are, but strictly in our own lanes. He leads the mission on the ground. I make absolutely sure that the mission possesses the resources so it doesn't fail."
Riker points to this as the ultimate example of true biological and social complementarity. It's a partnership of immense power, precisely because it is not two people competing to perform the exact same role.
Riker warns that modern society is actively suffering from what he terms complementarity collapse. This occurs when a culture attempts to erase these distinct lanes and enforce absolute interchangeability between the sexes.
He points to the nation of Sweden as the ultimate tragic case study of this collapse.
In 1975, Sweden implemented a radically progressive, gender-neutral parenting leave policy. The sociological goal was to socially engineer a society where mothers and fathers were viewed as completely interchangeable units of caregiving, fully decoupling child-rearing from biological sex.
Riker looks at the long-term, multi-generational results of this social experiment. Over the subsequent decades, Sweden experienced a dramatic decline in marriage rates.
Furthermore, their national birth rate plummeted to 1.5 children per woman, which is dangerously below the 2.1 replacement level required to sustain a population.
Riker's diagnosis is that when a state successfully erases the distinct biological and social logic of motherhood, fertility inevitably collapses.
Simultaneously, men culturally disengage because their unique hardwired roles as primary protectors and providers are deemed obsolete or offensive by the state.
To understand exactly how we arrived at this point of deep institutional capture, Riker takes the reader on a historical dive into the origins of the modern feminist movement.
He places the crosshairs squarely on Betty Friedan and her seminal 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique.
Friedan's book was a cultural earthquake. She claimed that millions of American women were suffering from the problem that has no name.
She described them as suffocating in the newly built suburbs, trapped in what she controversially called a comfortable concentration camp of endless homemaking, vacuuming, and child-rearing.
Riker aggressively deconstructs Friedan's methodology in her conclusions. He argues that Friedan fundamentally weaponized the concept of anomie.
In sociology, anomie refers to a state of normlessness, a feeling of aimless instability, and deep psychological alienation that occurs when social bonds break down.
Riker asserts that Friedan took the genuine anomie felt by a very narrow, highly privileged, highly educated sliver of upper-middle-class white women and projected it onto the entire female population of the United States.
He points out several glaring methodological flaws in her work. The famous survey of Smith College alumni that Frieden heavily relied upon to prove her thesis was never subjected to rigorous peer review.
Furthermore, Riker cites broader historical polling data showing that women in the 1950s, the era Frieden described as a psychological prison, actually reported significantly higher baseline levels of life satisfaction and happiness than women polled in the 1980s.
After the feminist revolution had fundamentally reshaped the workplace and the home.
Right. Riker argues that Frieden's work did not liberate women. Rather, it initiated a systemic, cultural devaluation of motherhood, framing the creation of a family as a barrier to true fulfillment rather than its pinnacle.
But the author doesn't just present a history of defeat. He offers a specific historical hero who recognized this ideological shift and successfully fought back. Phyllis Schlafly.
The text paints a fascinating contrast between the two women. While Betty Friedan was offering emotional angst and theories of oppression, Phyllis Schlafly was offering cold, hard facts.
Schlafly was a constitutional lawyer, a formidable debater, and a mother of 6 children.
In the 1970s, she almost single-handedly derailed and defeated the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which at the time was considered politically invincible and had the backing of both major political parties.
The book meticulously details the strategy Schlafly employed, which Riker dubs the maternal counteroffensive.
Between 1972 and 1982, Schlafly organized a massive grassroots network that oversaw the printing and mailing of over 3 million physical pamphlets across the country.
She didn't argue against equality in the abstract. She went line by line through the proposed constitutional amendment, exposing its hidden legal consequences.
She logically demonstrated how the broad wording of the ERA would unintentionally abolish a woman's right to alimony in a divorce.
It would eliminate the gender-specific draft exemptions that kept mothers out of military combat zones.
And it would legally mandate the dismantling of sex-segregated spaces like bathrooms and female-only dormitories.
She basically forced the public to look at the second and third order consequences that the original activists had ignored. Riker highlights a specific, highly publicized debate in 1977 where Schlafly went head-to-head with Betty Friedan.
During the debate, Friedan became visibly enraged, at one point famously telling Schlafly she would like to burn her at the stake.
Schlafly, maintaining total composure, calmly used structured logic and legal precedent to corner Friedan on the actual legal ramifications of the amendment.
Riker uses this historical clash to prove a vital point to his male audience. Structured, factual logic and unyielding composure can entirely defeat even the most well-funded, emotionally driven ideology.
The ERA ultimately failed to secure ratification, and Riker holds Schlafly's campaign up as the definitive playbook for men today. Do not get drawn into emotional mudslinging. Expose the logical consequences of bad policy, maintain your composure, and mobilize the sane majority.
This deep dive into ideological warfare brings us to perhaps the most intense, philosophically complex, and arguably alarming section of Riker's book.
The author transitions from political history to what he defines as the spiritual war and ideological possession.
Riker makes a critical shift here. He asserts that he's no longer just talking about Democrats versus Republicans, or even feminism versus traditionalism.
He views the current cultural landscape as a literal, ongoing spiritual battleground, and the primary weapon being deployed against the minds of men is heavily mediated by modern technology.
He introduces the terrifying concept of algorithmic possession.
To explain how this possession works on a practical level, Riker details a deeply unsettling 3-day experiment he ran on his own personal Instagram feed.
He started with a clean algorithm. Then, as he scrolled, he made a very slight, intentional engagement.
He encountered a comment under a video that broadly stated, "Men are toxic." He didn't like the comment, he didn't reply to it. He simply stopped his thumb and lingered on the text for just under a second before scrolling past.
That was the only micro-engagement.
And that single fraction of a second was enough for the machine learning algorithm to profile his psychological vulnerabilities.
Riker documents how, within 48 hours, the algorithm, which is designed purely to optimize for maximum user engagement and emotional outrage, had completely hijacked his feed.
By day 3, 60% of the content being pushed to his screen consisted of anti-male manifestos, viral threads complaining about toxic patriarchy, and videos of women expressing deep hostility toward men.
Riker uses this experiment to illustrate the mechanics of the modern matrix. He argues that social media platforms are not neutral public squares. They are sophisticated psychological engines that actively radicalize their users.
By feeding men a constant, highly concentrated stream of content that insists the world hates them, the algorithm induces a state of despair and paralysis, effectively possessing the mind of the user and rendering him incapable of positive action in the real world.
But Riker argues that this ideological possession isn't confined to the glowing rectangles in our pockets. It has leaped from the digital realm and infected the very institutions that govern our lives.
He argues that the state now actively enforces compliance with unreality. To prove this, he points to international law, specifically bringing up the Canadian C-16 bill.
This legislation was highly controversial because critics argued it effectively compelled speech by mandating the use of preferred gender pronouns under the threat of human rights tribunal penalties.
The book details the chilling, real-world application of this ideological enforcement through the case of Lindsay Shepherd. In 2017, Shepherd was a 21-year-old graduate teaching assistant at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada.
During the communications tutorial, she simply showed her students a brief clip from a publicly broadcast television program.
The clip featured two academics debating the nuances of transgender policy and compelled speech. Shepherd didn't endorse either side. She merely presented the clip to spark a neutral academic debate among her university students.
Yet, she was subsequently hauled into a room, interrogated for hours by a panel of senior administrators and a diversity official, and accused of creating a toxic climate and effectively committing violence against transgender students simply by allowing the debate to occur.
Riker highlights this audio-recorded interrogation to demonstrate how modern institutions demand total ideological possession. They don't just demand that you follow the rules, they demand that you actively affirm and convert to the underlying ideology.
He also mentions a veteran pediatrician with 30 years of experience who was fired by a major hospital network.
The doctor refused to automatically affirm the gender transition of adolescent patients, prioritizing his traditional medical training regarding biological development.
He famously stated, "I'm here to treat illness, not affirm ideology." The hospital fired him, prioritizing ideological compliance over decades of medical expertise.
So, if the technology is radicalizing us and the institutions are demanding compliance with unreality, how does a man fight back?
Roker suggests that men have to look backward to the deep philosophical roots of Western reason. He argues that the modern world is collapsing because the Enlightenment made a fatal, arrogant error. It attempted to completely sever human reason from religious faith.
This is where Raker's philosophical argument becomes quite dense, but it is crucial to understanding his worldview. He looks back to thinkers like Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, a brilliant medieval philosopher, did not see reason and faith as enemies. He viewed human reason as a divine gift, a tool specifically designed by God to help humans uncover truth.
Raker also points to Sir Isaac Newton. When Newton formulated the laws of gravity and motion, he didn't view his physics as disproving God. He viewed his mathematics as literally decoding the blueprint of the Creator.
However, Riker notes that modern philosophy tried to abandon this foundation. He discusses the collapse of the Vienna Circle in the early 20th century.
Right, and for those who aren't familiar with the history of philosophy, we should probably unpack what the Vienna Circle was.
Absolutely. The Vienna Circle was a group of elite philosophers and scientists who attempted to build an entirely new worldview based on a concept called logical positivism.
The core premise of logical positivism was that a statement is only meaningful if it can be empirically proven through direct scientific observation or if it is a strict mathematical truth.
They wanted to eliminate all metaphysics, all theology, and all concepts of absolute morality.
However, the movement eventually collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradiction. Philosophers realized that the core premise of logical positivism, the statement that only empirically provable things are true, cannot itself be empirically proven.
It is a philosophical assumption. It is a leap of faith.
Riker cites a remarkable 2022 survey indicating that 68% of modern philosophy PhDs now reject strict naturalism. They're slowly realizing that the scientific method and human reason itself require a massive foundation of faith.
You have to have faith that the universe is ordered, that the laws of physics will be the same tomorrow as they are today, and that your human brain is actually capable of perceiving objective truth.
Without an underlying divine telos, which is the Greek word for ultimate purpose or design, Riker argues that reason inevitably collapses into subjective chaos and societal nihilism.
Okay, let's ground that deep philosophy with a truly fantastic historical anecdote that Riker shares in the book. He talks about the intellectual journey of C.S. Lewis, the famous author of the Chronicles of Narnia.
In 1931, Lewis was an Oxford academic and a staunch, unyielding atheist. He viewed Christianity and all religion as nothing more than warmed over primitive mythology.
But one night, he took a famous late-night walk along Addison's Walk at Oxford with his colleagues, J.R.R. Tolkien, who would go on to write The Lord of the Rings and Hugo Dyson.
And what's vital about this encounter is that Tolkien and Dyson did not coddle Lewis. They engaged his formidable intellect directly.
They argued that humanity has always invented myths about dying and resurrecting gods, because the human soul intuitively yearns for redemption.
But they proposed that the story of Christ was the one true myth, the moment where the mythic architecture of the universe actually intersected with historical reality.
They argued that this event grounded the universal moral law, a concept Lewis would later define as the Taoist absolute objective reality.
This rigorous, logical, late-night debate was the catalyst that finally cracked Lewis's atheism and led to his conversion.
Riker uses this profound intellectual awakening to connect directly to the central metaphor of his book for his red-pilled audience, the movie The Matrix.
He uses the film not just as a cool sci-fi reference, but as a precise diagnostic tool. In Riker's framing, swallowing the blue pill means accepting the comforting illusion of dinocentrism.
It means accepting the societal lie that traditional male strength is inherently toxic, that modern HR departments are fair and meritocratic, and that the decline of the family is just natural progress.
Taking the red pill, however, is a brutal awakening. It's the painful acknowledgement of the harsh reality of deep institutional bias against men. He points to the scene where Morpheus offers the pills to Neo.
Morpheus explicitly states, "All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more." He doesn't promise happiness.
Riker argues that modern men must engage in this spiritual and intellectual combat. They must refuse to be NPCs, non-player characters, who simply shuffle through life repeating approved HR scripts, apologizing for their biological nature and ignoring the decay around them.
And this fight to reclaim reality, Riker insists, must begin not in the voting booth, but in the most foundational institution of all, the physical home.
This brings us directly to the author's argument surrounding fatherhood as a counter-revolution and his critique of what he calls the culture of death.
Riker posits that active visionary fatherhood is the ultimate act of strategic resistance against a corrupt society.
He shares a deeply encouraging story about Robert Lewis, the author of the book Raising a Modern-Day Knight. Lewis recognized that modern culture offers boys no clear path to manhood.
So he spent 18 years deliberately and painstakingly initiating his own son. He designed structured physical challenges, instilled a strict chivalric moral code, and formally guided his son into masculine responsibility, effectively inoculating him against the aimless enemy of modern youth culture.
He also shares a much more dramatic, immediate example of protective fatherhood. He tells the story of an Ohio father, a blue-collar machinist.
This man went to pick up his middle school-aged daughter from her public school one afternoon. She handed him a worksheet she had been given in class that day.
It was a highly detailed, ideologically charged questionnaire asking her to interrogate and redefine her gender identity and sexual orientation.
The father didn't write an angry email to the principal. He didn't complain on a Facebook group. He immediately pulled his daughter out of the public school system that very day.
Despite the financial strain, he and his wife began homeschooling her. Riker points out that this blue-collar machinist spent his evenings teaching his daughter classical Greek and formal logic, intentionally rescuing her mind from what he perceived as hostile, ideological enemy territory.
Riker elevates these actions into a core principle he calls paternal primacy. To give this principle historical and moral weight, he returns to the biblical narrative, specifically looking at Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus.
The Gospel of Matthew details how Joseph received a warning in a dream that King Herod, terrified of losing his power, was going to send death squads to Bethlehem to massacre all the male infants.
The text highlights Joseph's immediate response. Joseph didn't petition the government. He didn't try to organize a political protest or write an op-ed. He acted on divine foresight.
He woke his wife and the child in the middle of the night, packed their belongings, and fled across the desert to Egypt as a refugee.
He unilaterally executed a strategic retreat to protect his family from the murderous overreach of the state. Riker frames this story as the ultimate mandate of paternal primacy. The father's first and final duty is the physical and spiritual protection of his family. even if it requires defying the state.
Raker then starkly contrasts this protective, localized paternal presence with the devastating, measurable effects of fatherlessness engineered by modern policy.
He points heavily to the famous 1965 Moynihan Report, authored by sociologist and later Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Decades ago, Moynihan accurately and tragically predicted the massive social decay, the spikes in crime, poverty, and generational trauma that would inevitably result from the rising rates of single-mother homes.
Riker takes this historical warning and points a harsh accusatory finger at the 1996 Welfare Reform Act passed in the United States. He argues that the structure of the welfare system perversely and intentionally incentivized the removal of fathers from the home.
Because the government offered significantly higher financial benefits and housing assistance to single mothers on the strict condition that an able-bodied male was not present in the house, the state effectively bribed lower-income families to dissolve.
Riker claims that the state, through financial coercion, systematically tried to erase the biological father so that the government could step in and become the ultimate daddy and provider.
This analysis of state intervention and the devaluation of life brings us to the most highly controversial, emotionally charged stance in Riker's entire book.
He launches a direct, unyielding attack on what he calls the anti-life agenda, or the Thanatos culture, Thanatos being the Greek personification of death.
Riker aims his critique squarely at the legacy of the 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision. To underscore the deception he believes is inherent in the movement, he brings up the tragic life story of Norma McCorvey, who was the anonymous plaintiff Jane Roe in the landmark case.
Riker notes that in her later years, McCorvey publicly converted to Christianity and explicitly admitted that she had been manipulated and used as a political pawn by wealthy, highly educated activist lawyers who needed a sympathetic face for their lawsuit.
She spent the final decade of her life actively campaigning to undo the very Supreme Court ruling that bore her pseudonym.
Riker contrasts the political machinations of the abortion industry with the ground-level actions of a man named John Enser.
Enser moved to Dallas and opened a comprehensive crisis pregnancy center right in the middle of a high-crime red light district. But he didn't just hand out pamphlets.
Enser's organization offered pregnant women in crisis real, tangible alternatives. They provided safe housing, paid for medical care, offered job training, and supplied baby necessities.
Over the course of a decade, Enser's team ultimately saved over 1,200 unborn children from abortion.
Riker points to Enser as the embodiment of true male duty, using one's strength, resources, and foresight to actively protect the most vulnerable members of society when they are in crisis.
To further challenge the mainstream narrative surrounding abortion, the author introduces a very specific, often overlooked statistic from the Guttmacher Institute, which is the leading research organization supporting abortion rights.
The data reveals that approximately 60% of women who seek abortions in the United States are already mothers. They already have at least one child at home.
Riker takes this data and reframes the issue entirely. He does not view this primarily as a debate over women's healthcare access. He frames it as a demographic and spiritual tragedy, where financially stressed families are making the agonizing choice to eliminate their future brothers, protectors, and mentors.
He views abortion in this context as the literal pruning of the family tree and the deliberate severing of the male lineage and its protective capacity.
To counter this culture of death, Riker highlights grassroots movements where men are stepping up to reclaim their protective roles and rebuild their communities.
He mentions a fascinating initiative in Tennessee called the Sons of Steel program. This program recruits ex-convicts who have turned their lives around, along with military veterans, and pairs them to aggressively mentor fatherless boys in high-crime neighborhoods.
These men teach the boys emotional regulation, physical discipline, and trade skills. The result: Riker cites a staggering 40% drop in youth crime in the areas where the program is active.
He also details an initiative called the Legacy Registry in Ohio. This is an underground network where men pool their private financial resources and offer legal support to pregnant women in crisis.
The goal is to ensure that a woman never feels financially coerced by an absent, irresponsible boyfriend into having an abortion. These men are stepping into the gap, leveraging their own resources to financially sponsor the life of a child that isn't even theirs.
That deep protective instinct, that willingness to bear a burden for the future, ties perfectly into the final section of our deep dive today: honor, legacy, and the ripple principle.
Riker attempts to redefine the concept of honor for the modern man. He argues that true honor isn't about public accolades, social media followers, or buying status symbols. He He defines honor as load-bearing integrity.
It's the invisible strength that keeps the roof from caving in.
To illustrate this, he tells a fantastic, quiet story about a construction foreman in Toledo, Ohio. This foreman was overseeing the construction of a new public school building.
During the project, he discovered that the primary contractor was attempting to cut costs by using subpar, cheap steel I-beams for the main structural supports.
The foreman didn't scream, he didn't go to the press, and he didn't make a performative scene. He simply told the contractor he wouldn't build a school with bad steel.
And when the contractor refused to change it, the foreman walked off a $38,000 job, a massive amount of money for his family. He quietly absorbed the financial hit.
12 years later, an EF3 tornado ripped through that exact town in Ohio. The school that was built with the bad steel was completely flattened, but the structures in town that this foreman had built with true integrity, they stood firm and sheltered the people inside.
Riker fiercely contrasts this quiet, invisible, life-saving honor with the performative emotion demanded by modern media. He points out a behind-the-scenes reality TV incident involving the famous adventurer Bear Grylls.
Grylls was allegedly pressured by his network producers to literally fake crying on camera while eating a raw seal liver simply because the algorithm demanded emotional vulnerability to boost ratings.
Riker says true honor is silent. It is structural. It never performs for the camera.
This concept of quiet honor serves as the engine behind what Riker conceptualizes as the ripple principle and action multiplicity.
He argues that isolated acts of deep integrity compound across time in ways we cannot mathematically predict.
He returns to history, looking at the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the brilliant German theologian who actively resisted the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer was ultimately captured and imprisoned in the Flossenburg concentration camp, where he knew he was going to be executed.
Yet even in a freezing dark cell, he did not surrender to despair. He wrote profound, complex theological letters to his friends, smuggling them out of the prison written on scraps of toilet paper.
And those letters survived the war.
Exactly. They survived and became some of the most influential theological writings of the 20th century. But Riker also points to Bonhoeffer's actions before his arrest. Before the war fully escalated, Bonhoeffer ran a secret underground seminary at Finkenwald, where he trained 150 young pastors in Orthodox theology and resistance to state idolatry.
Those 150 men became a hidden immune system within Germany, keeping the truth alive during the darkest period of the 20th century.
Bonhoeffer's actions multiplied across time, eventually crossing the ocean and heavily influencing the theology and nonviolent resistance strategies of leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the American Civil Rights Movement.
Riker couples this historical reality with modern data. He cites a fascinating 2018 simulation conducted by researchers at MIT on the mechanics of social change.
The study found that it doesn't take a 51% majority to change a culture. It found that a committed, unwavering, uncompromising minority of just 10 to 15% of a population can completely flip the established opinion of the entire group.
Riker uses this to encourage his readers. Endurance beats energy. One fully awake, uncompromising man can wake 10 others if he simply refuses to apologize for the truth.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now, looking at the future?
Riker concludes his massive work by introducing the time shift lens and the concept of ancestral debt. He wants men to fundamentally alter their relationship with time.
He argues that you, listening to this right now, exist and enjoy the comforts of the modern world only because a great-grandfather you never met worked a terrible, dangerous, bone-crushing job in a coal mine or a factory just to put food on the table for his kids.
You owe an immense, unpayable debt to the past, and the only way to honor that debt is to pay it forward to a future you will never see.
He shares two incredible stories of this legacy in action. First, he highlights the Foxfire magazine project that started in 1972. A school teacher in rural Georgia, struggling to engage his high school students, sent them out into the Appalachian Mountains to interview the old forgotten mountain men.
The kids learned how to split wood, how to preserve food without electricity, and how to build a log cabin. The old men, who felt completely discarded by modern society, suddenly realized that their hard-won knowledge was vital for the survival of the next generation. It bridged a massive generational gap.
The second story is even more personal and profound. Riker tells the story of a blue-collar steelworker in Pittsburgh who, back in 1971, decided to start writing a small, leather-bound journal.
He wasn't writing it for himself. He specifically addressed it to a future grandson he knew he would likely never live long enough to meet.
In that journal, amidst descriptions of the brutal heat of the blast furnaces, He wrote a single defining sentence regarding work-life balance. He wrote, "I didn't work for balance. I died for it. I won't."
He was writing about refusing to let the corporation consume his soul, insisting on leaving time for his family. 48 years later, in the year 2019, that unborn grandson had grown up to become the CEO of a massive Fortune 500 company.
He was drowning in corporate stress, on the verge of losing his family. He found his grandfather's journal in a box in the attic.
Reading those words written half a century earlier by a man in a steel mill fundamentally shattered his perspective. It changed how he ran his multinational company, forcing him to restructure his life to prioritize his own children over the corporate grind.
The grandfather's foresight saved the grandson's family from beyond the grave.
Because of stories like this, Riker ends the book by issuing a direct, demanding challenge to his readers. He challenges every man reading the book to sit down and write a legacy blueprint, a physical, handwritten letter addressed to a future grandchild.
He wants men to aggressively reclaim the term, the grandfather clause. Originally, this was a deeply racist legal trick used in the American South in the 1890s to suppress voting rights.
But Riker repurposes the term. For him, a true grandfather clause is a moral map, a philosophical constitution left behind for future generations.
He argues that even if you feel isolated today, even if you think no one is listening and your efforts do not matter, a grandson 50 years from now might find your letter hidden in an attic.
And in a world that will likely be even more chaotic and confused than ours, your words might provide the exact compass he needs to navigate his own struggles.
Wow. It is an incredibly dense, heavy, and intense book. We've covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today.
We really have. We started with the linguistic roots of the Adamic mandate in Genesis, waded through the sociological double bind placed on modern men, unpacked the terrifying reality of algorithmic possession, and concluded with the deep, multi-generational responsibility of fatherhood and legacy.
It is a text that demands a great deal from the reader. It is not a passive read. It actively challenges the fundamentally accepted societal norms of the past 50 years. And it requires men to step into a level of severe personal responsibility that modern, comfort-driven culture often tells them is unnecessary, outdated, or even toxic.
Absolutely. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've talked about grand historical examples from Abraham Lincoln to the Roman Republic, and we've explored deep philosophical concepts.
But let's distill all that down and make it intensely, uncomfortably personal.
If modern society is truly an engineered matrix, a system designed to meticulously extract your male labor and attention while simultaneously suppressing your natural authority and protective instincts, what is the very first tangible step you will take tomorrow morning to unplug from that algorithm?
What will you do to reestablish real physical sovereignty in your own household? Think about it. Because knowing the architecture of the trap is only the first step. Stepping out of it requires action.
It ultimately comes down to a question of application. As the author rigorously notes throughout the text, knowledge without physical decisive action is simply vanity.
Truly.
Well, that brings us to the end of this incredibly thorough deep dive. I want to remind you one last time to please take a moment to like and subscribe to the show. It makes a huge difference for us and helps us keep producing these in-depth analyses.
And remember, as soon as this finishes, head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy the ebook we discussed today, Virtue of Foresight, Men's Premonition, Strategy, and Synchronicity by Conrad Riker.
And don't forget to follow the author directly at Conrad Riker over at Substack at conradriker.substack.com to keep up with his latest writings. Thank you so much for investing your time and joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.